Good morning and welcome again to our series on what is Anglicanism, Anglicanism 101. This morning we are going to look in the form of an overview at the English Reformation, but specifically with the intent as to how it relates to our topic. Before I begin, I need to offer a disclaimer. It's been brought to my attention that when you see me up here, I rock back and forth or I move around a lot. There is a reason for that, and that is I have two ruptured vertebrae in my spine, and I can't stand straight for an extended period of time because of the pressure it puts on my lower back. So you see me rock back and forth to relieve the pressure. I apologize. I know that's a distraction. I have been told by students for 30 years that it drives them crazy, and I wish I could stand in one spot for any extended length of time, but I can't. So hopefully you won't become too seasick watching me move back and forth. But anyway, I just wanted to let you know. As we've been going through, one of the things that I have wanted to emphasize was that this is not an historical overview. We are leaving out tons of material that would be required to be studied if we were doing an actual historical recitation of English Christianity. So what we're looking at are those topics, those issues throughout the history of the English Church that relate to the question, what is Anglicanism? This morning I want to put a board here that no one here can see except for the people in this room. This is essentially a snapshot of what we've been talking about for the past, I don't know how many months, okay? We started with Christianity in the UK. We started very early. And the point of this is that as we moved forward, there have been, I took my markers away, this is really going to be a fun day. As we move forward throughout history, no, it's okay, don't worry about it, yes. Yeah, don't worry about it. As we move forward in history, one of the things that we have seen is that the church in the UK has always been a church in tension. There has never been a monolithic position that the church in the UK has held. It's never been all of one thing or all of another. And this contributes to our understanding of what Anglicanism is because it eliminates the discussion by those that want to say Anglicanism is X and only X, whether it's the people that claim that Anglicanism is only what it was in the first century, or the people that claim Anglicanism is only Protestant because it comes out of the 16th century. That's simply factually false. And what we're going to see this morning is that when we get to the English Reformation, Henry becomes a primary figure. Yes, because of the split, but because people constantly misunderstand the split. And what I have here, that none of you out there can see, is that when Henry broke from Rome, Henry remained a Roman Catholic. Henry did not break from Rome and then create something that was not Roman. So Henry was just ticked off and decided that I'm going to take my marbles and go someplace else and start something else. But it was essentially a Roman church that he was starting. Which brings us to this morning. The English Reformation, as the Great Britain expression of the European Reformations, and by the way, there isn't one Reformation. There were Reformations in France, Spain, Germany, Switzerland, Scandinavia, Holland. Reformations took place all over Europe, And part of the reason that we identify them as Reformation, there's actually, there was a great book written by, I think it might have been Stephen Osmond, but don't hold me to that. But it was entitled The European Reformations. And if you'll remember, one of the things that we discussed, especially in reference to Great Britain, was the rise of nationalism. And with the rise of nationalism came specific national identities, and therefore there became specific reformations attached to those specific national identities. And the English Reformation was a major religious and political movement in the 16th century. And it led to England breaking away from Rome and from the authority of the Pope and the Roman Church. So, though part of the broader European Protestant Reformation, the English Reformation had a unique political and personal dimension to it. It was a complex and transformative series of events in the 16th century that led to the Church of England breaking away from Roman authority. Some of the key issues. Number one, Henry VIII. Now, under Henry VIII, we could go through an entire course on his problems. But Henry sought to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon because Catherine had not produced a male heir. And for them, that was the function of wives. You were readers. My apologies, but that was the case. The Pope refused the annulment. Anybody know why?
He was related to the wife.
We'll get to that in a minute, but you're on the right track.
The Holy Roman Emperor was related to Catherine.
You guys are okay. You're on the right track. You're all over the map. You're on the right track. The Pope refused the annulment, prompting Henry to take control of the English Church. If you're not going to give me what I want, then I'm going to do what I want, and I'm going to mean to you. And that's what Henry wound up doing. But Henry was still a Roman Catholic, even though he abjured from Roman papal authority. Okay? He rejects Roman papal authority, but he maintains a very significant Roman theology. Now, Charles V of Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor, just waiting for you to write down the name, was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. And Pope Clement VII, probably one of the most beleaguered popes, because he was a man of peace that wound up smack dab in the middle of European wars. Much like Charles, actually. Charles did not have any desire to be fighting conflicts everywhere. But because of the relationship between Catherine and her nephew, Charles V, the Pope, who had previously granted annulments to others, declined to grant an annulment to Henry. So, on the one hand, Henry really did have a grievance. It was he felt that the others were being treated with favoritism and he was being singled out because of the relationship that Catherine had with her nephew. And with the international squabbles that were taking place at the time, Spain and France and Rome, and eventually Holland would join in, the Pope decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and he sided with Catherine, maintaining peace with Charles, at least for a short period of time, and denied Henry his annulment. Um, It was purely political. There was virtually nothing theological about the popes denying the annulment. Now, Henry was Catholic and Roman. That's a stupid statement, but Henry was advocating and advancing Roman Catholicism, but he saw the Reformation and her Protestant advocates, not the least of which was Anne Boleyn, who had become enamored with Lutheranism, as a way to consolidate his power and reduce the influence of the Pope and the Roman Church in English affairs. So, Henry, though Roman, used his Protestant officers in his court to advance his political motivations. Another factor involved in this, another contributing benefit, if you will, was Henry's dissolution of the monasteries. He eliminated all of the monasteries, and that allowed the crown to seize all of the money and all of the land from the monasteries, significantly enriching the monastery and the nobility and providing him with funds to counter any reprisals, at least as far as he saw. And then, of course, we can't get away from Protestantism itself. Luther's ideas were spreading like wildfire. The printing press became the avenue for Reformation. If you had an idea and you had somebody that had a printing press, that idea became widespread. The Protestant critique was numerous. We've gone over in the past the issues with clergy, the issues with corruption. Protestants wanted to promote direct access to the Bible. They advocated salvation by faith alone, through Christ alone. Henry, for his own merits, one way or the other, vigorously opposed Luther and Lutheranism. And he even wrote a tract attacking Luther. So here's the King of England, who was always identified with creating the Church of England, which, as we have seen, a church in England has always existed. It just winds up taking on a specific meaning with Henry. But here he is, advancing Roman Catholicism, critiquing Protestantism, even though everybody accuses him of creating Protestantism, essentially. And he wrote a tract called The Defense of the Seven Sacraments, in opposition to Luther. Now, he probably had help, significant help, by John Fisher, who we will look at next week. And for this work, and keep this in mind, for this work, Henry was declared by Pope Leo X, prior to the split, Defensor of Fides, defender of the faith. In 1534, Henry enacts the Act of Supremacy. Well, the Parliament Act is the Act of Supremacy, declaring that Henry VIII, or that all future monarchs of England, would be the head of the church. And this was officially the break with Roman authority. The Bible, of course, we know, as we have seen throughout this discussion, translated into English. We've also seen that that was considered a crime. I don't know if you know this, or if anyone has told you this in the past, but Bibles were actually chained to lecterns in churches, and they were, in many cases, they had shields around them. People couldn't touch them, couldn't read them, were not allowed to read them, even if they could read them. So it was a seismic event when Wycliffe, Tyndale, and others decided to translate the Bible into English, and then you have Luther translating the Bible into German, directly into German. Most notably, of course, for the UK, for Great Britain, were two specific Bibles that came out of this time period. The first one was the Great Bible, and there was the Geneva Bible, sometimes conflated. The Geneva Bible, by the way, was the Bible that was brought to the United States by pilgrims. And then there was the 1611 King James Bible, which went through like multiple iterations before they settled on 1611. What wound up happening, as always is the case, that the subsequent ruler put their stamp on what the church would be now that the Act of Supremacy was in place, and now that the monarch was the head of the church. So you have different people with different personalities and different ideas developing different elements of the church. And the first one was Edward VI, the boy king. Now most people, most historians will say that though Edward VI was the official king of England, it was Norheim that was actually the king, because he was Edward's cult confessor, but he wasn't the confessor. He was Edward's mentor. He taught Edward everything that Edward needed to know. And from 1547 to 1553, for that 6-year period, there was no period in the English church where it was more Protestant. It was unequivocally, unilaterally, definitively Protestant. We even have the prayer book under Edward VI, which is distinctly Protestant. Well, unfortunately, when you become king at 9, during a time when healthcare wasn't run by socialists, you die. And Edward, unfortunately, died. And you will hear many Protestant scholars lament the death of Edward. Because had Edward stayed and lived a normal life, Anglicanism would most definitely have eliminated all of the confusion as to what it was. It would have remained a distinctly Protestant denomination. No, there's no question about that. Well, in 1553, Edward unfortunately dies, and his sister takes over, Mary the First, who has been identified very unfavorably as Bloody Mary. She tried to put it politely, she tried to reverse the Reformation. The source that I said, lending to the persecution of Protestants. A more apt description would have been the extermination of Protestants, because she wanted to literally kill all of them. They were heretics in her thinking. Now, remember, I think we talked about this once before. The mindset at that time, now Mary may be a different kettle of fish, but the mindset at that time by the church was, if someone is advancing heresy, we would rather kill the body and save the soul. That was the mindset. Whether we agree or disagree, they took spiritual matters very seriously. So if we're going to put a full-orbed perspective on Mary, we would say that what she was trying to do was she was trying to save people by killing them. I'll let you deal with the conundrum. Then, in 1558, interesting how the first two monarchs following the death of Henry only lasted 5 years each. But in 1558, Mary was arrested for various reasons. You can look it up in history. There's all sorts of political intrigue with Mary's situation, by her sister, Elizabeth I. And Elizabeth tried as hard as she could to redeem her sister. Not spiritually, politically. Because Elizabeth knew that, given what had taken place, the political machinations that were working behind the scenes, Mary was going to be executed. And Elizabeth tried and tried and tried to cajole her sister into recanting, and etc., and Mary refused. And Mary was executed. And for the next 45 years, Elizabeth rules. Under Elizabeth, we have the Elizabethan settlement. And what it did was, and this is what drives a lot of people to distraction, is that while Elizabeth never identified with one party or the other openly, she never actually said, I am this or I am that. What she did in the Elizabethan settlement was she allowed a form of Protestantism to exist side by side with her Roman bishops. And this is where you see the litany of scholars, pundits, people in general, articulating that Anglicanism is a Protestant church. Now, we can spend a lot of time debating that. I'll open this for questions in a minute. But this is simply the reality. Elizabeth created a situation where you have two competing ideologies fighting for dominance. The one thing that comes to mind is the statement that Elizabeth makes when she is having a discussion with her bishops, all of her bishops, Roman and Protestant. And they keep pushing her to make a choice. Pick one, pick one, pick one, pick one. And her response was, and this is a clipped version of her response, but her response was, gentlemen, I am not looking to create windows into the souls of men. In other words, where your heart moves you in the faith is where I will allow you to be, as long as it's not heretical and it's not a conspiracy to overthrow the crown. Now, the interesting thing with Elizabeth, which drives the non-Protestant representatives of Anglicanism crazy, is her archbishop for a very brief time, because she died in 1603. But her archbishop was John Whitgift. And John Whitgift had a running argument with a number of Puritan Protestants. Now, why is that significant? Because Whitgift was a Protestant. Whitgift was not only a Protestant, Whitgift was a high church Calvinist. And he and Matthew Parker went back and forth because Parker leaned towards the Puritan camp. And they fought, and they fought, and they fought. And Whitgift's decisive blow to win the argument was, I was chosen by the crown, I'm the archbishop, you're going to shut up and do what I tell you to do. Most people would assert that Parker probably had the better arguments. I doubt that, but that's what most people would say. But Whitgift stands as a unique figure within this time frame, because on the one hand, there's no question of his Protestantism. I mean, he's a high church Calvinist. But on the other hand, he's a high churchman. And at that time, being a high churchman meant you supported the crown. Everything that the crown did. And that was Whitgift. Whitgift was a loyal subject of Elizabeth. Well, briefly we'll go over some of the effects. Whatever or however one views Anglicanism at this point, it was at this point in period where the Church of England became distinctively her own entity. And this is where people say that Henry created Anglicanism. Yes and no. But it wasn't because he was trying to start a new church. He stayed Catholic, he just wanted a divorce. And just think, if the Pope had given him the divorce, we would never have this. We wouldn't be having this conversation. It would be an entirely different conversation. At least until 1547, when Edward takes the throne. So, during this time period, we have the English church coming to ascendancy as a church equal to, but separate from, both Rome and Protestantism on the continent. Protestantism on the continent. This is the problem that we have facing us today. Are we Roman Catholic, or are we Protestant, or are we neither, or are we both? And if you've been following along, what you have been hearing me proclaim is that Anglicanism is both and neither, both, in exclusivity. It is not exclusively one or the other. It is Catholic in its truest sense. And that's what Anglicanism, that's what the Reformation, the English Reformation, did for us. It allowed us to be Catholic in the truest sense. If we identify Catholic with the early practices of the church, there's no question that Anglicanism falls into the category of being Catholic. We represent that. But we can't deny the influence of Protestant theology in the Reformation. You can't do it. You would literally have to excise a whole litany of not only individuals and ideas, but chunks of history you would have to remove from the English church if you say it's not Protestant. So theologically, there are numerous and very, very serious representations of Protestantism within Anglicanism. The 39 Articles, for one. Whether you come down on the side of the 39 Articles being Reformed, or whether you come down on the side of the 39 Articles being Lutheran, and I disagree with a lot of people. I think the 39 Articles are more Reformed because of the influence of Butzer on Cranmer, but that's a different discussion. The 39 Articles stand as the confessional document of the church. It rejected the excesses of Rome, which it states, and it rejected the excesses of the Anabaptist, which it states. And just for your own benefit, you've heard the term the via media, the middle way. You will hear some people argue that the middle way was not between Rome and Protestantism. The middle way was between Geneva and Wittenberg. And if you look at the 39 Articles, that bears out that statement, because we just expressed it. Are the 39 Articles primarily Lutheran, which would be Wittenberg, or are they Reformed, which would be Geneva? So that's what comes out of the break created by Henry. More effects were, there was political centralization. Monarchs had greater power over the church. There was a cultural shift. Now, because the separation from the papacy is official, now, and we have seen this. Remember, we've talked about this push and pull between the English monarch and the Roman primate. We've seen it previously. So this shouldn't be a surprise for us. But in this, national identity arises, and there's a proud national identification at this time because of what Henry had, and it wound up shaping the future of Anglicanism and the English people. Of course, because of the break, it led to conflict between Protestants and Catholics, including numerous civil wars. There was a period there for years where the Protestants and the Catholics were killing each other. It wasn't only one-sided. It went both ways. And all one has to do is read the history of Oliver Cromwell to find that out. This allowed the monarchy to centralize its power by eliminating papal influence. So now the monarchy in England controls England as well as the church. We've already talked about the wealth of the church being increased because of the dissolution of monasteries. Initially, the Reformation was more about who was going to run things. It was more about authority than it was about doctrine and theology, but over time, that changed rapidly. Major roles of Parliament at this time were the Act of Supremacy in 1534 and the Act of Succession in 1534, which required subjects to swear allegiance to the king's new marriage and heirs. So if you don't like Catherine, we'll go to Anne. And if you don't like Anne, we'll go to Jane. And if you don't like Jane, and the hits and heads just keep on rolling. And then, of course, there was the Act of Uniformity in 1559, which created massive pushback, but it mandated the use of the Book of Common Prayer throughout all of England. I'm going to stop there. I am open this up for questions, but there is one thing that I handed this out to you at the very beginning, the Anglican way. So go back through your notes from all those months ago, because I gave this to you, and by the looks on your face, you probably don't remember it or don't have it, and I will forward it to you. But this was written by Lancelot Andrews, one of the greatest divines in Anglicanism. Another man that very, very, very adeptly and adroitly balanced both sides of the fence. And he wrote this: "In the providence and grace of the Blessed Trinity and under the lordship of Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever, the Church is based on 1. Canon of Holy Scripture. In 2. Testaments, Old and New, that reveal an identical truth of the glory and the mercy of God. The unity of God's Word written is not to be divided by privatized judgment, but to be proclaimed as the apostolic and primitive Church understood by the Holy Scriptures." So, what we've been talking about. That understanding is recorded in 3 ancient and ecumenical creeds, the Apostles', the Nicene, the Athanasian, and in the teaching of the first 4, not 7, notice, 4 general councils: Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon. Finally, I always wonder why they start with Nicaea and they don't start with the Jerusalem Council in 49 AD, but that's a different discussion. Finally, the general life of the Church in every era is to be guided by the life of the undivided Christian Church of the first 5 centuries in worship, discipline, ministry, and mission. Thus, the Anglican way is a life in Christ, under God the Father, with the Holy Ghost, in unity with the Church of the Apostles. Okay? So if you ever see somebody say, the Anglican way is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, that's what they're referring to. 1 book, 2 testaments, 3 creeds, 4 councils, 5 centuries. That's usually how it's summarized. Okay? Questions?
So, I was just wondering, why was it so important for Henry to have a male heir if it was, legitimate for Mary and Elizabeth to, occupy the throne later on? I guess I wasn't sure if what was going on there. Like, why was that so necessary?
Well, there are 2 general reasons. Number 1 is the social personal reason, and number 2 is the practical outworking. It was a social. How do I want to put this? Okay, I'll be blunt. Your masculinity was questioned if you couldn't produce a male child. I mean, that's ultimately what it was. They questioned your manhood. Practically speaking, that was the only way that the Tudors were going to continue their line, is if the women took over. Henry's goal, his desire, his love was for his son that Edward would continue the line and that collapse. And once that collapsed, in order to maintain Henry's lineage, they had to allow the sisters to rule.
Did they change the law to allow that, or was it?
No, there was no official change that a woman, at least nothing overt, There may have been some work, there's some machinations behind the scene so that it didn't throw egg on their face. But for the most part, what they looked for more than anything else was heredity. And that's what created the problem with Elizabeth, because Elizabeth was Anne Boleyn, if I remember right. It was daughter of Anne. And there was a question as to whether or not Henry was legally married to Anne. So this created all sorts of issues with Elizabeth's reign. But ultimately, I personally, and this is my personal opinion, so you can do with it as you will, but I think everybody recognized that Elizabeth was a measured, intelligent woman, and that their best bet was to stick with her because she was sharp, she was a savvy politician for someone younger. She didn't back down from anybody, and in many, many ways, she calmed the seas a little bit of what was taking place within Great Britain. So history looks at her with justifiable admiration. She was quite a leader. And in my opinion, she set the tone for future British monarchs, especially the women that came. Queen Victoria, for example, another one. Strong, smart, ruled well. I think it stems back to Elizabeth's example. But that's, again, as I said, that's just my opinion. Anything else?
What would it have been about the 39 articles that would make it either more Lutheran or more Reformed?
Well, that depends. About bringing them with me. The issues that create the question on the tone of the 39 articles revolve around the sacraments, and it revolves around salvation. So if you start looking through Articles 8 or 9 through 16, where it starts talking about salvation by faith alone and justification and all of these things, there is an argument that says when you deal with these doctrines, it was Bucer's influence on Cranmer and his suggestions for modification of the 1549. By the way, is anybody familiar? Do you know who Martin Bucer was? I mean, I know I mentioned him briefly once. Okay. Bucer was, he was a French reformer. He ministered primarily in Strasbourg. And just like all the reformers at the time, he was unceremoniously told to get lost. But he and Calvin had a very, very close relationship, and they influenced one another. Bucer was a strong influence on Calvin's understanding of church government, which was not theocratic. That's, people don't understand Calvin because they don't understand Bucer or have never read Bucer. And Calvin influenced Bucer slightly on the Eucharist, because Bucer was always identified primarily, though not exclusively, as a Lutheran. But Cranmer wanted to have a general council. He wanted to invite all of the he actually did invite all of the reformers throughout the continent and England to come to England to have another great council. Calvin expressed his interest and desire to come, but it never came to fruition. And Luther was on his way out anyway. Physically, he was dying, so he couldn't make it. Melanchthon agreed, but in God's providence, it never came to be. But Butcher did come. So did Peter Martyr Vermigli from Italy. And Vermigli much less than Butcher. But they contributed to editing the Book of Common Prayer. When Butcher wrote his critique of the Book of Common Prayer, he listed, it's been a while since I've taught this course, he listed 54 suggestions to change in the Book of Common Prayer, in the 1549. Of those 54, Cranmer implemented, and depending upon how you break down the actual suggestions, 26 to 28. Martin Butzer had a almost 50% influence on how the Book of Common Prayer. So here's where you come into the battle of whether you were talking about the articles as being Lutheran or Calvinistic, because you got Butzer, who was both Lutheran and Calvinistic. He was both. And then, of course, outside of Articles 9 through 16, then we have the questions of election and predestination. And everybody looks at those and they say, well, those are obviously Lutheran. That is not correct. Again, that's a misreading of Calvin. And this is part of the problem with this. And I had a bishop. I sat down with him. I wrote him a 3-page explanation of Calvin's view on predestination. And I told him, it is not what you hear in because you hear the same refrain over and over again. The articles do not support double predestination, therefore they're not Calvinists. Well, Calvinists don't believe in double predestination. Those are hyper-Calvinists. That's William Perkins, who was an Anglican. That's William Perkins. That's Theodore Beza. That's John Gill. That's all of these guys. These are the hyper-Calvinists. Calvin did not believe in double predestination as they define it. Now, are there instances of double predestination in Scripture? Well, of course there are. Pharaoh, Judas, they were never going to be saved. So they were predestined to hell. Judas is referred to as the son of perdition from before the foundation of the world. But was it a general application to all of mankind to which Calvin was referring? No. Now I'm saying this in stark opposition to one of my own professors, who used to call us all cowards. He used to say, if you're not a superlapsarian, you don't have the courage of your convictions. Well, I just can't believe that God is that arbitrary, where he chooses people based on nothing but his sheer will. Calvin and the rest of the Reformers believed that God chose people out of fallen humanity, so there was something against which he was working. So his mercy was truly merciful, because all of humanity is fallen and dead in their sins, and God can be holy and perfectly just within his right to say, I want this, and this. And that is mercy that he's giving. Or he can just say, you guys can do what you want, I'm not getting involved. That's justice. He leaves people to their own devices. So there's where the challenge comes in when we look at the 39 articles. And it also involves the discussion of church history prior to that, setting up all of the circumstances and the context in which the 39 articles were written. Well, you'll be leaving, so I can't say this. I said, well, we can go over that in the future. But
try to watch the videos.
Yeah. that essentially is like the thumbnail.
Okay.
And it's now 5 after, and I kept you too long, so it's time for morning prayer.